right. Yes. All right. It is time for our second panel, harnessing more water in the wet years to get us through the dry years. If you could all take your seats, we've got a lot to get through in this panel, so I'm going to jump right in. We will have a 15-minute break after this panel, so you can continue those conversations afterwards. I'm very excited to be joined by this illustrious panel today. Just very briefly, first we have Ara Azhderian. Ara is the general manager for the Monterey County Water Resources Agency. Prior to that, you were also GM at Pinoche and water policy admin at the San Luis Delta Mendota Water Authority, right? So you're bringing us a little bit of experience both from the Central Valley and from the Central Coast. And you also come from a farming background, which I didn't know until I read your bio. So that's great. Also, we have Laurel Firestone. Laurel was appointed to the State Water Resources Control Board in 2019 and then again in 2023. Prior to that, she co-founded and co-directed the Community Water Center, which is a nonprofit environmental justice organization that's focused on safe drinking water and community issues. So Laurel is bringing us her deep knowledge on community and drinking water issues for this panel. So we're very grateful to Laurel for being here and swooping in right at the right moment so she could be involved in this panel. Next, we have Daniel Mountjoy. Daniel is the Director of Resource Stewardship at Sustainable Conservation. He leads the water program at that organization, so that means he spends a lot of time thinking about how we can, what are the best approaches for conserving and replenishing our groundwater supplies in the state, and he's also bringing us many years of experience on the ground, farm and land management, and that type of thing. So welcome, Daniel. And then finally on the far end here we have Lance Eckhart. Lance is the general manager at San Gorgonio Pass. And prior to that, he was basin management and resource planning at Mojave Water Agency. So Lance is also bringing his experience from many years of consulting on groundwater and natural resources in Southern California. So welcome, Lance. Yes, and so as Ellen mentioned in her welcome, it was a pretty good year for water supplies and for storage. We saw some really excellent action on groundwater recharge and that type of thing, but this panel is all about striking that balance. It's something that we always have to think about in California with the way our weather works. We have to manage our flood risk, but we also have to think about capturing those supplies when they're available, whether we get them above ground or get them below ground. It's critical for just evening out those wild swings and making sure we have what we need. So that involves a lot of challenges, whether it's coordinating between our surface storage and our recharge efforts, whether it's dealing with the limitations and the infrastructure that we do have. There are a lot of hurdles to get over to make sure we're managing that in the right way. So before we dive into the supply questions, Ara, I do want to give you a chance to just comment on anything you heard in the previous panel. I know the name Pajaro came up a couple of times, and I imagine your agency was quite involved in dealing with the aftermath of the levee breach in Pajaro. So any follow-up thoughts on that panel before we dive in?
Yes. So we were very involved, certainly in Pajaro, and I guess when I think about the lessons learned this year, there's a little bit of human nature and kind of the human condition that emerges out of all of that for me. And certainly it was, a tragic natural disaster, and the recovery is underway and will continue for some time. But, this isn't the first time that community has gone through this. And in the mid-'90s, when this had occurred previously, there were devout exclamations about never again. And, people being people, the recovery occurred, other crises emerged, the regulatory environment got more difficult, costs escalated, funding got redirected, and then 25 years later, we're right back where we started. So I think that cycle, we've all seen it, one time or another on a whole variety of projects. That's not a Pajaro-specific condition. And so if there's sort of a lesson learned in that for me, it's about how do we capture those moments and, beyond just sort of the reaction to it, sustain the initiative so that, a better outcome can be had in the future. The good news with respect to Pajaro is the Army Corps, the local regional flood management agency, and others will be having a signing ceremony here on November 21st to begin the implementation of the long-conceived replacement levies, and the aim of that is to bring a new level of protection for that community, and looking forward to that. But it's a long road ahead. So, anyways, that's my thought.
Yeah. Okay, great, thank you. All right, so first topic I want to go into depth on is groundwater recharge. So, as most of you know, groundwater is what we turn to when our surface supplies get low, when we're in a drought. That's really kind of our reserve for drought situations. Groundwater recharge is also, it features very heavily in groundwater sustainability agencies' plans for bringing their basins back into balance. It's important for drinking water, and it bears mentioning there's a lot of storage potential there underground, really more than all of our surface reservoirs combined. So that's why I think recharge is such a big topic, and it's going to feature a lot here in this discussion. I want to start with you, Daniel. Sustainable conservation is doing a lot of work on flood-managed aquifer recharge, capturing excess flows, spreading it on land, particularly farmland, to get it into our aquifers. So in this excellent wet winter that we had, what did we learn about implementing flood-mar? How do we scale this up quickly? How do we do it responsibly? And what are the ways that it could intersect and maybe even help with managing flood risk?
Yeah, this year was definitely the big opportunity that oftentimes, disasters trigger creative thinking and trigger change in people's interests and motivations. And one of the key lessons really from this year was that those that were prepared, those that had thought about it in 2017 and in 2019, the last high flows, really were prepared and were able to capture significantly more water for recharge than they'd ever done before. And Aaron Fukuda at Tulare Irrigation District is always cited for how much they've accomplished this year, over 100,000 acre feet of recharge. And really that started back in 2014, 2015, thinking about how do we motivate our landowners, how do we think about conjunctive water use, which has been going on for decades with building storage basins, recharge basins throughout the San Joaquin Valley region, and I'm mostly speaking of that region where the overdraft is the greatest. And that concept of building more basins starts to be questioned when you see the fluctuation in rainfall availability or runoff availability. It just doesn't make sense from a return on investment perspective to build enough basins for those extreme years, and then farmland really becomes your overflow location, and managing that overflow can achieve these really significant increases. And so what we're starting to see is a trend and an acceptance amongst the agricultural community that they can actually be part of their groundwater supply solution by making their lands available and replenishing water under their farms for future dry years. And so it's both becoming more accepted by growers and by districts that are ahead of the game on that. I think the big steps for scaling are, again, taking it from these localized areas that were prepared in this last year to incubating that concept in a whole variety of other places, because all of these solutions are very local, very land dependent, crop dependent, irrigation district dependent, where you can do this. And so more pilots, more demonstration by farmers and irrigation districts working together to demonstrate what they can achieve will lead to our next water year having significant achievements that were achieved this year. The other piece of that is the permitting aspect, and the executive order and SB 122 were really critical to being able to tap into the high flood flows this year, and some clarification of those policies to make sure that we know when those triggers really are appropriate, and many areas that don't have established triggers needing to establish those where they don't have clear flood plans in place, and also establishing more temporary water rights processes that clarify what can be done under the state board's jurisdiction so that those folks that are applying for that really can do that with state support for some of the data that's needed to make those determinations, rather than district by district trying to establish and prove that there's sufficient water. Doing more statewide analysis of that is going to be really critical. And then the flood piece of this, again, back to the Tulare Basin and the issues of the flooding there this year. If all of the lands in the Tulare Basin had done what Aaron Fukuda and the Tulare Irrigation District had been able to do, there could have been significant reduction in that flooding. There were many, many areas that could have taken water that didn't think that was necessary, didn't think it was required for their SGMA, or didn't see it as a strategy for their SGMA implementation, and simply weren't prepared. And we're looking right now at flood studies in many areas of the San Joaquin Valley to look at how much could be diverted on available land with existing conveyance, with existing permits. This is low-hanging fruit that could be applied elsewhere.
Okay. Well, in the spirit of trying to figure out how to do this across more and more places in the state, Lance, you've been actively involved in groundwater basin management in the Mojave. You're also working on some recharge activities in San Gorgonio Pass. Tell us how that's going and how these desert basins can, why that's important locally, but also how those basins can be part of a statewide system of basins, if at all.
Yeah, absolutely. We have plenty of storage in the state. It's already built. So we've been blessed with geology. So 3/4 of the project already exists in the ground. There it is. Take it. And part of Southern California does a pretty good job of utilizing the local groundwater basins to somewhat drought-proof many of the areas. But it takes a lot of forethought to build the basins, have the money set aside to recharge it when it's wet. You might not use the water for a number of years, and you've got to get your boards on board to put that money aside just to pay the electric cost for those wet years when you've got everything wide open like this year. Some of the things that we've been figuring out is that we saw earlier this morning that we built and plan everything on average, and we just don't have average anymore. It's kind of a California thing. It's becoming even more of a California thing where you might have 2 or 3 wet years, then some average and a whole bunch of dry, and those swings, those higher highs and lower lows, are becoming a little bit more profound. So what that means is that you have to invest in more recharge basins and have your electeds and stakeholders look at them and go, yeah, they're going to be dry 7 years, and everybody really questions your planning. And then in years like this, they're all full and they ask, boy, I wish you had another 50 acres of recharge. Why didn't you guys think about that? And so that's the conversation. So some of the things that we're doing is we're doubling down and buying more land for recharge, knowing that they're going to be empty and you got to look at them for many years. The other thing is we're trying to partner with, there's beautiful desert aquifers on the backside of the San Bernardinos and San Gabriels, can store millions of acre feet of water. And we've been talking about it for decades and just can't get it going. These are kind of, I call them the medium-sized projects, where you might need $100 million to get something like that going. But relatively speaking, it's way cheaper than a $5 billion reservoir, which we're also investing in. And those things are ready to be used, and a tremendous amount of storage in the state. I'm going to caution, though, and then I'll hand the mic off, that these types of really, to me, obvious solutions and relatively low-hanging fruit, utilizing the natural infrastructure that is already built, is predicated on local boards. And so you've got local boards, the staff say, hey, if we just had $100 million or $200 million and we could bank all these people's water and we get to keep a little bit, but they take most of it out, it scares everybody. And so I think this is maybe bigger than some of the local boards to tackle, and there needs to be some form of greater regional leadership or federal or state, or help to facilitate and build some assurances that we can utilize this California resource that's untapped, and not scare the heck out of these local boards that it just might be something too big for them to tackle. But again, the storage project's built. Go get it, California.
Yeah, with regard to planning on the averages, I've heard that referred to as the 42 in Fargo conundrum. 42 is the average annual temperature in Fargo, North Dakota. But if you dress for 42 degrees all year round, you're going to be miserable for 6 months out of the year and dead for the rest of them. So that's how planning for the averages goes. Ara, on the same theme, the Central Coast is highly groundwater dependent. You don't have a lot of surface storage you can rely on. I know that Monterey and your agency are working on doing recharge with recycled water and also some activities higher up in the watershed. But you also, you live in a really flashy system. You're dealing with a lot of fluvial flooding conditions. You need your levees to deal with that. So what's the strategy for a place like the Central Coast and Monterey? Are managing flood risk and securing more supplies mutually exclusive objectives?
Yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. It's really that flipping back and forth between the water supply operations and the flood control operations. So we own and operate 2 reservoirs in the southern portion of the Salinas Valley. And they serve both purposes, right? And so we're doing flood control in the wintertime when the rains are significant, such as they were this last year. And then we're doing what we call conservation releases throughout the summer and into the fall for groundwater recharge purposes. And that's, by and large, been very successful for decades, 75 years, 50 years for the reservoirs, right? And so that, I think that piece of the equation is working well. To Daniel's point, taking the twist on the old realtor's adage, it's geology, geology, geology. And so we see greater success in the southern part of the Salinas Valley than we do in the northwestern part, where we have more clay lenses, we have more granite, we have more geological features that make that piece of it more challenging, and we'll be working through that, as we continue our Sigma planning. The flashiness of the system, it is what it is, and the locations of levees are more or less important depending on where you are. Clearly in Pajaro, they are a vital protective mechanism. On the Salinas River, a little less so, right? It's a wide, meandering river, and people will go in there and they'll farm it during times when they can, and then there'll be years like this year where the river's going to do what the river's going to do. And so I don't think it's mutually exclusive. It really comes down to the question, perhaps, in those marginal areas about land use ultimately, and what are the choices that we're going to make in terms of land use about how to utilize that if it's going to be used for agricultural purposes. In certain areas, there just needs to be a recognition that, I'm going to be able to use it in some years and other years not, kind of like YOLO bypass is a good example. And so I think, it's a combination of things, but it is very locally dependent, I think.
I think the hydrogeologist at the end of the line here really appreciates that that argument. So thanks, Ara. Okay, Laurel, the time has come to ask you about permitting. How we saw some great advances on that front this year with groundwater recharge. So tell us what the board is doing to facilitate these kinds of efforts and to streamline groundwater banking, stormwater projects, and just recharge writ large.
Yeah, so we've been doing a lot just in the past year, and really over a 5 or 6 month period, we permitted 1.2 million acre feet of recharge. That's by far the largest that we've done. And that's in addition to things like the clarification around flood flows and that don't need permits, but just need to be following certain guidelines to basic common sense groundwater quality protections and public safety protections, but also making sure that they're reporting so that we can be transparent about what water is being recharged where under flood protections. But what we've established, and really this started in 2014, 2015 era, was looking at streamlining, creating temporary permits. We have both a 180-day permit and a 5-year permit. We've reduced fees across the board, really clarified the guidelines for 180, where you don't need a permit, 180-day permit, 5-year permit, and really what we want everyone to get to, which is a permanent permit. This, as you said, this is our new normal. We need to be building this in as a permanent water supply management strategy. A big limitation, though, is applications. So we can streamline all we want, but if we don't have projects coming in for applications, we can't permit them. Same with funding. We've been able to fund $1.2 billion in water infrastructure projects, but we can only fund what comes in for things like recharge projects. And that doesn't the planning and assessment and getting board buy-off and that visioning, all of that needs to start early. You can't do that, even in our really quick turnaround. It still takes 5 months for a 180-day permit. You need to be starting now. You needed to be starting yesterday. But I will say what made a huge difference this year is that there was incredible collaboration and partnership across the administration. DWR and Bureau of Reclamation took major leads in developing applications, working with landowners, building off all the work that Floodmar has been doing and the tools that have been there so that we did have applications that we could permit. And so, I think what we're hopeful is that after this year's learning and success in permitting a lot of recharge, that we can get these sort of longer term permits and applications and projects in so that it can be a more permanent part of our water supply portfolio.
Okay, great, thank you. That's great to hear. Shifting gears a little bit, I want to talk about infrastructure now. We've seen the limitations of our current water grid in the past year. For example, we had water that was left on the State Water Project and Central Valley Project this year during the periods of high flows because we didn't have enough storage for it south of the Delta. At the same time, these big ticket infrastructure projects are seeming like more and more a thing of the past. So, Lance, I want to come back to you because you touched on this in your earlier comment. Is that sort of how you read the situation? And if it is those medium projects that we really need to be focusing our attention on, where are the bottlenecks to bringing those online?
Yeah, well, I am worried. Can California build anything anymore that's major? That really, has me concerned. It looks like there's some big things going on now, so hope springs eternal. But I think the medium-sized projects, for example, we're tapped out right now. We're at the end of the line of the State Water Project, so we're kind of a drip emitter at this big artery, and we're building some more recharge and doing what we can, but we're going to be limited by what we can do. We're partnering with some of the desert agencies to store water, and the problem is when it's really wet like this and it catches you off guard, everybody's picking up the phone, and before you can get the words out of your mouth, hey, can you take any water? They say, hey, Lance, I'm glad you called. Can you take any water? And so everybody's looking to store water everywhere. There are places, but these are larger, again, bigger than a one entity to do a multi-agency project. It is incredibly difficult, and you've got to do this, and I'll be very quick, is you have to have 5 things together with time eating away at this whole process. You need stakeholder support to say, yeah, it's a big swing, but we're going to take it. You need to have staff that says, we're confident we can see this project through. You need to have a board that says, this is a big deal, let's do it, and I may not stand under the shade of the tree I plant today, but that's okay. We're going to hold together and make that decision. So that's the 3 local things. You have money that's always getting eroded. So you put money aside, but it's not worth this, as much tomorrow as it is today. And then you have regulatory uncertainty, which slows the whole thing down. And the regulatory uncertainty has its finger on the dial of entropy, which pulls all this apart. So you've got to have all these 5 things together, and time just erodes this. And if you have 1 or 2 of these things fall apart, these projects never get done. So I think that making these decisions, truth suffers from too much analysis. Taking the big swing, getting the projects done, and holding this together and go, this is so important, let's push this through. I think we can do it, but it's very tough, and I think that some of the medium-sized projects are going to be multi-agency and will need some type of state or federal steward to help foster these things. But there are some major geologic assets in California that are untapped, and as a geologist, it just breaks my heart. But again, it's too. You need all those 5 things, and you probably need a larger governance to help take you by the hand and steward the process and say, yeah, we can get this done. I hope.
Ara, do you have any thoughts you want to add on to that?
Well, I'm certainly glad Lance simplified the entire process.
Everyone
for
take
us.
notes on that, by the way.
But I agree entirely, and the observation about the regulatory side of this is, how complex of a regulatory environment we have created for ourselves, right? And we have multiple agencies weighing in on multiple aspects of a single project, each with its own perspective, each with its own authorities, each with its own abilities. And it adds time, and it adds cost, and it adds complexity, but are the outcomes really getting improved? I'm not certain that they are, and so to Laurel's point about, this year, given the circumstances we were in and the actions that the governor and the state took to streamline, at least on the state side, a lot of the work that we were doing in the context of emergency recovery, that helped a lot. There were a lot of good projects that were able to get done, that were important to get done, and the outcomes really didn't change much, notwithstanding the fact that we simplified it. We didn't see the same thing on the federal side, unfortunately. And so for large projects, and setting aside the complexity of medium projects, it's navigable perhaps. But there's room for small projects too, right? And I'm kind of an all of the above sort of guy. And you hit singles enough in a baseball game, you're going to win eventually. So the problem with the small projects is the height and the number of hurdles that they have to go through, certainly the number of hurdles they have to go through, is the same. And for a small entity to have to run that gauntlet, maybe the height of the hurdles is a little different, but to have to run that gauntlet makes it extraordinarily challenging. And so small projects that could fit in niche locations and provide niche outcomes really can't be lifted just because of the complexity of the regulatory environment we've created.
I'll jump in. First of all, I think permitting 1.2 million acre feet in 5 months in underground storage is a big deal. It is a big deal. It is swinging. So I think we need to think a little bit less of let's build giant concrete things, and let's look at how we can accomplish the same results with multi-benefit. I mean, you talked about certainly focusing on big things in terms of recharge. We need to be doing that, but we also need to be making sure that the way we do it matters. Are we doing it in areas where it can benefit communities that don't have safe drinking water, don't have a reliable supply, in overdrafted basins? That's one of the really exciting things about flood MARs. It's really in the exact areas where we're also trying to cut back. What we can do in terms of just reducing our water use, whether it's urban water use efficiency or SIGMA, groundwater management plans. What we permitted this year, 1.2 million acre feet, is the same scale as what Kern County pumps out each year. So there's tons that we can do that are huge projects that maybe don't look so big and fancy, but have huge results and implications. And I think lastly, one of the really exciting things is thinking about these multi-benefit projects, especially with things like stormwater in areas that have been left behind by past infrastructure projects and our past water planning. And so that's true with Tulare and examples of recharge basins right around communities whose wells have gone dry or become contaminated. But it's also true in urban areas in LA where they're looking at cleaning up groundwater basins, recharging, addressing stormwater, water quality challenges, building green infrastructure, and all of these things addressing urban heat islands. Water conservation helps address a lot of the greenhouse gas emissions that our sector and the water sector address. So I think when we think, how can we do something big in the state? We're doing really big things in the state. They just look different.
Can I just add one more thing on green infrastructure? In terms of the permitting challenges, the state now, under the Cutting the Green Tape initiative and under simplified permitting that Sustainable Conservation has been involved with all the state and federal agencies, work around river systems to expand floodplains is a much more simplified process, and it really incentivizes the restoration and the flood benefit and recharge when the geology is correct.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Daniel. I was going to ask you about that because in our previous panel, Jane did mention floodplain expansion and that type of thing. So do you think we could be paying more attention to these things and make them a green infrastructure rather than concrete infrastructure? And is there greater scope for incorporating things like meadow restoration, multi-purpose recharge basins that aren't just, tanks of dirt for 7 years out of 10 in our portfolio of storage options?
I think we're seeing some great examples. Really what we're talking about is reconnecting the hydrologic process from, as you mentioned, from the mountain meadows all the way down through the riparian systems. The floodmar, sort of diverting water off onto farmland, is sort of an extension of that, where the floodplains used to spread across the alluvial fans coming out of the mountains. We're doing that in a very managed way, but there's an opportunity for a lot of these green infrastructure solutions as well. I think it's going to be driven by the necessity to manage for floods. In the floodmar studies that DWR has been leading, that we're participating in the Merced, we're looking at 6-fold increases in peak flood events. And there's no way that that's going to be contained in the current conveyance system of our river systems. And so we either need to divert all that water off, which is also a major infrastructure investment, or we need to widen those rivers. So I think flood management will drive this green infrastructure strategy along the floodways. And there's lots of low-lying areas that also have good geologic conditions for recharge. And even if they don't have rapid recharge, it's slow recharge, it's habitat, it's migratory bird habitat. There's all sorts of other benefits that come along with that. It's going to be replacing what we narrowed down on our landscape.
Well, on this theme of multi-benefits, Laurel, I want to come back to you again on that. Of course, you've been deeply involved in securing drinking water for underserved communities during your time at Community Water Center. Now you kind of have a vantage point on policy and implementation. So tell us a little bit about what's going on with the SAFER program, with small system consolidation at the board. How is that going, and what still needs to happen?
Yeah, well, a lot has been going. We have, since 2019, established the SAFER program. We've had $1.3 billion that the legislature created for over 10 years to really not just unlock solutions for communities, but unlock the additional funding we have from the feds and state to be able to drive sustainable water solutions. So since the beginning of the program, we have 200 communities that have returned to compliance since the beginning of that program. Unfortunately, at that same time, we have had at least that number begin to fail. And so one of the most important things we've found is that we need to not just address, with not just put on Band-Aids or address those systems that are failing, but also look at all of those at risk. And in California, we have an incredibly fragmented system, 7,000 public water systems. You compare that to something like 900 wastewater systems. It's, incredible fragmentation. You talked about challenges with boards and getting boards. We have been really focused on, as we build for resilience, as we prepare for this new normal, how are we shifting the structure, the governance structure, really, and the delivery structure of our drinking water across the state. And a big piece of that is consolidations or building economies of scale in different ways. We are just about to celebrate I think over 115 or so communities that have joined together. There are double that are in the process of joining together. So we are seeing a huge change, but I will say a lot more is needed. It's really not realistic for communities that are, serving a couple hundred low-income families and rely on a single well in agricultural areas where you've got a lot of overdraft and historical contamination, to be able to provide reliable, safe water. We have to change how we've been doing things. And to do that, we need to be looking at building economies of scale, looking at how we can join systems together. What we've seen really successful in some areas are where there are regional regional drinking water, water management, and wastewater governance structures that can serve disparate communities, even if they're not physically interconnected, where they can operate together more holistically rather than having each individual, either household or small community, fend for themselves. So we've invested $1.2 billion over the last couple years. We've seen 1.3 million people return to compliance, but we also have close to 400 that are in the process of getting there. We have a lot more work to do. I think we will see in the next few years a huge increase in the number of systems that are getting safe drinking water than what we've had. But I also will say change is hard, and it does take us keeping an eye on the ball and making sure that we're getting there and ultimately able to achieve the human right to water here in California.
Great, thank you, Laurel. There are many other things that I would like to talk to this panel about. We didn't get to everything, but we have about 2 minutes left, so I want to do our quick lightning round with you all as well. So if you could take about 30 seconds each to tell me if you could change just one thing that would make your job easier, be that a policy or some other sort of mechanism, what would that thing be? I'll start with you, Ara.
I'd circle back to streamlining the regulatory environment. The intentions are good. The need for the analysis and the understanding of the impact is important, and it's an essential part of the whole thing. But the structure that we've created for all of that is extraordinarily inefficient and really inhibits the ability of large and small projects to move forward that can address a variety of problems we're facing, from connecting small communities, water systems, to building new big dams. So that would be my one.
Laurel?
I would have a single kind of one water regional agency throughout the state that felt its responsibility and took on the responsibility for the whole region for water management, drinking water, wastewater, groundwater sustainability, so that we were less fragmented and siloed and had local sort of regional partners that had economy of scale to be able to partner with us on getting these projects done.
Yeah, mine's somewhat similar. It's alignment of different interest groups. If we're going to advance recharge, to have the environmental community, the actual communities, environmental justice communities, and the water needs work together to define what the water availability is that we can actually divert off, and the quality of that water that can be recharged. Defining that up front so that permitting can take place is going to be really essential to expansion.
I think I'd like to kind of flip the California model where we get through droughts and we have this idea of managing by lack, and when really California, hallmark of California is just abundance. And if we approach it that way, we might actually go, it's the high years that really matter for us, like the ones we just experienced. What did we miss? We missed a lot. And we're getting ready for the next drought, but should we be getting ready for the next deluge? And what are we doing to capture the spirit of a few decades past to make these things a reality? So I'd like to see the model flipped on its head. I think we should not manage for droughts. I think we should manage for the wet periods, the deluges. I think it would change everything.
Yeah. Even when that's not in the forecast, right? You never know.
So. That surprised us last year. Be ready.
Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. I'd like to move to audience Q&A. So again, just raise your hand. One of our mic runners will come along and hold the microphone for you. And if you're online, that address for sending your questions is ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. I'll start with Sal.
What about land use? What should we be doing to make sure that sites suitable for groundwater recharge are not paved over or sited for incompatible uses like concentrated animal feeding operations?
Right now under SGMA, there's a lot of land that's going to become available for alternative uses. And with our modeling that we're doing, we're finding that there's acres and acres of suitable land that is available right now for recharge, if we're talking about storage, that I think certainly around urban areas where there's urban runoff that you're trying to capture, that probably is most relevant. But I think we need to really start talking about incentivizing lands going out of production to sites that are create incentives for those landowners to use that land for recharge where it's got excellent conditions.
In Southern California, it's kind of rougher. You got to really scramble and buy the acreage when it's available. I've got a very, very quick story. I went down to Orange County Water District many years ago looking for sage wisdoms of some of the most proficient managers of a groundwater basin in the world, and they all went to every office, said, what's this pearl of wisdom you'd give me? They said, buy land early. And they didn't compare notes, and every one of them told me the same thing. And because they had the same issue. They just could not find the suitable areas, or the areas they could find were in the suitable geology. And so it's move fast, even if you got to park it and idle for a while, get it before it's gone.
I'll just add, we have, SGMA and GSA's, one of the, I think, important pieces of that is that counties are involved, and they have to be part of the land use planning process to be able to zone things and make sure that they're aligned with the groundwater planning that we're doing, and that's part of the vision. I think that's starting to happen now in ways it wasn't before.
All right. Gokcha, did you have a question here?
I grew up in a community that, for water supply, depended upon desalination, Santa Barbara. 40 miles south of Santa Barbara is Oxnard, the second largest area for growing strawberries. And those strawberries are courtesy of desalination. And I realize it's not even a footnote among water people, but is this like talking about whale oil powering our lights in the future, or is there something here?
Yeah, so, desal can happen at a number of different levels, right? There's good enough for irrigation, there's good enough for potable, and it doesn't just have to be ocean water when we're talking about it, right? It can also be subsurface drainage. So I think about the Grassland Basin drainage area in the San Joaquin Valley. Tons of groundwater, super poor quality, but at some point it's easy to imagine this nexus where the value of water and the cost of treatment intersect, and suddenly it becomes economically feasible. And I don't think that's decades away. I think it's much closer than that. Certainly in the Central Coast region, we began doing water treatment for irrigation purposes. We were amongst one of the first projects to do that a quarter of a century ago. That's been a great success in taking pressure off that particular subbasin. And as we look towards the future, there are other ideas that, and these are words when I mash them together don't always make sense to me, but seawater intrusion barrier, and the idea being that we can extract in locations that are conducive to protecting, creating a barrier and protecting the fresh water from the seawater. So I don't think it's whale oil. I think it's more like LEDs, and we are looking forward, and I think, we will see more of that moving forward throughout the state.
I think we had a question from this side of the room.
Okay, thanks. So the idea of transferring water from wet years to dry years is something we've been doing for many years. The idea is that maybe we can increase our capacity in these very wet years and reduce our reliance on dry year extractions. From a rational planning viewpoint, that makes a lot of sense. The problem that I see that you really haven't covered is that, we're going to add, hopefully, a lot of new groundwater and surface storage projects, right? That's the vision. These projects are not going to only extract water in extraordinarily wet years. In order to be viable, they're going to be extracting water when there's surplus water in most years, except the very dry years. And water management, which reduces flows and flood peaks in the middle range, years that are not really dry, years that are wet but not extraordinarily wet, are what drive the health of populations, fish and wildlife populations, the health of habitats and ecological processes. So an unintended consequence of this rational water reliance on wet years could actually drive some pretty devastating consequences on ecosystems. And by the way, thank God for regulatory processes that don't allow us to just fast-track projects that might exacerbate that. So I'd be interested in the thoughts of the panel on how do we avoid that kind of unintended consequence of what seems like a good idea, but could wind up to have some consequences that I don't think Californians want to see.
You want to take a stab at that, Daniel?
Yeah. Well, as we all know, there is no average years. And I think one of the key pieces that I mentioned just really briefly in terms of the lightning round was we need to determine what flows are actually available without harm to the environment. And that's a key foundation to this whole endeavor of recharge and capturing flows. In wet years, it's probably not as big an issue as you say. It is in those moderate years that we really need those definitions worked out. And the California Environmental Flows Framework is one approach that has been sort of a collaborative, multi-agency academic strategy. And I really feel like we need to be able to see what does that look like on various types of water years with climate change, and what does that equate to in terms of total water that is extractable without doing harm, so that we have a better sense of how big a solution is this. It's really clear from the studies we've been doing in the San Joaquin Valley, we're not offsetting all the groundwater. PPIC study came up with 25 to 30% of overdraft might be offset with this. So we can't think of this as get every drop and solve every problem. We need to balance it, again, back to collaboration with the environmental community needs to be at the table in this to define those limits and do it in a way that makes sense from what do we need to preserve our fish populations and our aquatic environments as well as the delta.
Investing in science, I mean, that's one of the things. Get those conversations going and use the scientific method. It's a system of systems. If you can't measure it, you can't manage it, and you can't manage it. And so part of having dueling experts is people getting around the table, and I used to be a scientist in a former life, and actually working the problem and doing it in try to do it in an unbiased way or without an outcome to really manage the system of systems. But you got to make the investments in science. It's hard because a lot of people want to invest in concrete and steel and things, and we have to study this for a number of years, but you'll never get to there without investing here now in a collaborative way. So strong support for science.
And, our regulatory agencies, we need to do our job. We need to be able to set our Bay Delta plan. We need to be able to set in-stream flows and make sure that we have standards that are clear, that lay the rules out for us all to work around, for our system to work around. We can't do that without good data. We can't do that without folks coming together and seeing the same things about what is it going to take to protect this, and understanding that science. But we also have to be willing to put those rules in place, and I think that will help us all be working from the same understanding as we develop projects forward.
Did you want to add something, Laura?
Well, just one last thought, and it's about thinking about impact temporally, right? And it's not just about establishing a baseline that holds through all circumstances, because not all circumstances have the same effects, and sometimes there's going to be waves to this, and I think recognizing that reality and thinking about impacts over time as opposed to instantaneous is a way that we can help balance outcomes.
Great. Anyone else? Sal?
I've got a question from the online. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay, I've got a question from our online, an online viewer who's asking. It seems like there are an infinite number of projects that could be done. How do we prioritize the best ones when there's limited money?
Great question. Anyone? Laurel, I'm looking at you.
Well, we do a lot of prioritizing, and we always. I will take this opportunity to just say, I think we're seeing even just the baseline of funding, while it's drastically reduced in terms of water infrastructure funding from the federal government over the past few decades. Even just this year, we're seeing drastic potential cuts to our base SRF program. And that has really real impacts on things like affordability and ability to get things done. So I just, shout out to, we need more money. And you always need to prioritize. We do, you have to balance the who's ready to go so that we get the money out, but you also have to look at where are there going to be the biggest benefits, how are we building in equity in those areas that can't afford it any other way. There are agencies that can finance things without governance, without a state or federal government assistance. But there's many that can't and need grants, for example, instead of loans. I do think we're going to, as we look at how we expand the pot, we need to be looking at how we're building more loan capacity, more especially below market loan capacity than what we've had in the recent the recent past, and what's happening with the SRF is going the wrong way. But we are trying to be much more explicit about building in equity, identifying where there are those areas most in need, and proactively going there with technical assistance so that they are ready to go when money is available, and it doesn't just pass them by and we're not just exacerbating the same patterns.
I've done a lot of work with our local integrated regional water management plans, which is a whole list of projects that rack up multi-benefit, looking for disadvantaged community, ton of grants, ton of that type of work. Those are wonderful. I think a year like this, though, I'm going to go back to my lightning round, is what moved the needle on what we lost, or what we could have, not say lost, but we could have recaptured before we went out to the ocean. And I think that to kind of relook at that, how we do that cost-benefit analysis, because there was a serious material amount of water that we were not able to capture due to our inability, not being prepared. And re-racking the projects on prioritizing on when this happens again, not if, how are we going to make real moves to move real volumes of water back into the state, into the grounds for the future drought. And we have lots of smaller projects and community projects. Those are super important too. But again, I caution us not to be distracted by what we lost or the harvest as water harvesters that we did not harvest this year. And I think that should be a reprioritize for some of the larger supply projects.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Spencer?
Hi. This is more a question around rhetoric and engaging with large landowners. It was mentioned earlier that they're quite isolationist and protectionist. Everyone around them be damned. What are ways to engage with them that can kind of sell them on personal benefits, as well as getting groundwater management agencies involved to benefit everyone around them as well?
Okay. Engaging with large growers. Daniel? You want to take a stab at that?
Well, I think a big motivator right now is Sigma. If you know that you're going to have a restricted pumping ability in the future, there's a lot of motivation to be part of a solution. And so whether you're a large grower or a small grower, being part of that solution is critical. But not every farmer has the ability to make those changes. They may not have surface water delivery. They might not have the right geology. So the other big piece of this is within the grower community, within the irrigation district community, working together to figure out what's the most cost-effective way for those folks to invest in their future water supply. And we're seeing that popping up. I mean, there's a lot of districts that are really talking this through now about how do you incentivize those that can to do something, and for those that can't, how do they contribute to the benefit for their groundwater basin. You may be referring more to the Tulare Basin and the flooding, and I think that region just needs to have start having conversations. They don't even have a structure in place, as we heard from Jane earlier.
Great. So unfortunately, our time is up. So I want to everyone give a big thank you to our four wonderful panelists. We're now going to move into a 15-minute break. So get up, grab yourselves a cup of coffee. We'd ask you to be back in your seats by 11:30 for our final panel of the day.